The kitchen floor was covered in shattered glass and Sarah stood there trembling with anger as she looked at the chaos in front of her because her dog Max had somehow managed to destroy the sliding glass door leading to the backyard, and her 2 children, Emma who was 6 and little Tyler who was only 4, were both crying on the couch covered in bits of debris, and Sarah felt her blood boiling as she turned to Max who sat there in the middle of the mess panting heavily with small cuts on his paws and dirt all over his golden fur, and she pointed her finger at him and said, "What is wrong with you? Why would you do this?" And Max just sat there with his ears down looking at her with those big brown eyes that seemed to be searching for understanding, but Sarah was too furious to see anything other than destruction because the glass door had been expensive and the kids were scared and the house looked like a disaster zone, and she grabbed Max by the collar and pulled him toward the laundry room, saying, "I cannot deal with you right now," and Max went willingly, but he kept looking back at the children as if he needed to make sure they were still okay, and Sarah slammed the laundry room door shut and leaned against the wall trying to catch her breath because this had been the worst afternoon she had experienced in a long time, and she could not understand why her dog, who had always been loyal and loving, would suddenly act like he had completely lost his mind. But to understand what really happened that day, we need to go back to that morning when everything seemed perfectly normal and Sarah had woken up early like she always did because she worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, and being a single mom meant she had to juggle everything on her own, so her mornings were always a rush of making breakfast and packing lunches and getting the kids ready for their half day at summer camp, and Max was there like he always was, following Emma and Tyler around like their own personal guardian, because ever since Sarah had adopted him 3 years ago from the local shelter, he had bonded with those kids in a way that sometimes surprised her, and Emma would share her cereal with him even though Sarah told her not to, and Tyler would use Max as a pillow when they watched cartoons, and Max never complained. He just let those kids do whatever they wanted because he loved them more than anything, and Sarah loved Max too, but if she was being honest with herself, she sometimes got impatient with him because he had this habit of being overly alert, and he would bark at things that seemed like nothing, and he would pace around the house at random times, and she often found herself saying, "Max, calm down," or "Max, stop it," because she had so much on her plate and she did not always have the patience to figure out what he was trying to tell her. And that morning was no different because as she rushed to get the kids out the door, Max kept standing in front of the hallway closet and whining, and Sarah just stepped around him and said, "Not now, buddy, I do not have time for this," and she got the kids to camp and came home to work, and Max was right there at the door waiting for her like always, and she gave him a quick pat on the head and went straight to her office to start her projects because she had a big deadline coming up and she could not afford any distractions, and Max followed her to the office doorway and sat there watching her, and she glanced at him and said, "Go lay down, Max, I need to focus," and he eventually walked away, but something about the way he moved seemed different that day, almost hesitant, like he wanted to stay close but knew he was not supposed to. And a few hours later Sarah picked up the kids from camp and brought them home, and that is when things started to get strange because as soon as they walked through the front door, Max was there, but instead of his usual excited greeting he was pacing back and forth near the kitchen, and his ears were perked up and his nose was twitching, and Emma said, "Mommy, what is wrong with Max?" and Sarah looked at him and shrugged, saying, "He is probably just hungry," and she told the kids to go play in the living room while she started preparing a snack for them, and Max followed her to the kitchen, but instead of sitting by his food bowl like he usually did, he kept going to the wall near the stove and sniffing at it, and then he would come back to Sarah and nudge her leg and then go back to the wall, and Sarah looked at the wall and saw nothing unusual, and she said, "Max, stop it, you are being weird," and she gently pushed him away and continued cutting up apple slices for the kids, but Max would not stop and he started scratching at the wall near the baseboard, and Sarah felt her frustration building because she had just vacuumed that morning and now there were scratch marks on her wall, and she said, "Max, no, bad dog, stop that," and Max looked at her and whined, but he did not stop. He actually scratched harder, and Sarah grabbed his collar and pulled him away from the wall, saying, "I do not know what has gotten into you today, but you need to calm down," and she walked him to the living room where Emma and Tyler were playing with their toys, and she told Max to stay with the kids, and she went back to the kitchen, but within a minute Max was back at that wall scratching and sniffing, and this time he started barking, and it was not his normal bark, it was this urgent sharp sound that made Sarah jump, and she stormed over to him and said enough, and she grabbed his collar again, but this time Max pulled away from her and ran toward the kids, and he stood in front of them, blocking them from walking toward the kitchen, and Tyler tried to get around him to come to Sarah, but Max gently pushed him back with his body, and Emma said, "Mommy, Max will not let us move," and Sarah felt her patience completely snap because this was ridiculous behavior and she had work to finish and the kids needed their snack and her dog was acting like he had lost his mind, and she walked over and said, "Max, move right now," and she tried to push him aside, but Max held his ground, and he looked up at her with those eyes again, and she could swear there was something almost desperate in them, but she was too frustrated to pay attention, and she grabbed his collar firmly and started pulling him toward the laundry room, planning to put him in there until he calmed down. But then Max did something he had never done before. He pulled back so hard that he slipped out of her grip, and he ran to Tyler and grabbed the back of his shirt gently with his teeth and started pulling him further away from the kitchen. And Tyler started crying because he was scared, and Emma started crying because Tyler was crying, and Sarah yelled, "Max, let go of him right now, what is wrong with you?" And Max let go of Tyler's shirt, but he did not move away from the kids. He stood in front of both of them like a shield, and Sarah was breathing hard now from anger and confusion, and she said, "That is it, I am calling the vet tomorrow because something is seriously wrong with you." And she turned to look at the kitchen because she needed to get those apple slices finished, and that is when she noticed something she had not seen before. There was a very faint haze in the air near the ceiling above the stove, and for a moment she thought it was just dust in the sunlight, but then she realized there was no sunlight coming from that direction, and her heart started beating a little faster, and she took a step toward the kitchen, and Max immediately started barking again, that same urgent, sharp sound, and Sarah paused because suddenly his behavior was starting to make a tiny bit of sense, and she sniffed the air, and at first she did not smell anything unusual, but then she caught this faint chemical smell that reminded her of something, but she could not quite place it, and she took another step toward the kitchen, and the smell got stronger, and that is when she saw a small wisp of smoke coming from behind the stove, and her heart stopped because she suddenly understood what that smell was. It was the smell of electrical burning, and she remembered that the wiring in this house was old, and the previous owners had mentioned something about needing to update the electrical panel, but Sarah had never gotten around to it because there was always something more urgent, and now there was smoke coming from behind her stove, and she could see a faint orange glow near the wall socket, and she screamed for the kids to get out of the house, and she ran to them and grabbed both of their hands and pulled them toward the front door, and Max was right there with them, running alongside, protecting them, and they burst out the front door, and Sarah pulled the kids across the lawn, and she turned back to look at the house, and she could see smoke starting to billow from the kitchen window, and she grabbed her phone from her pocket and called 911 with shaking hands, and within minutes she could hear sirens approaching, and her neighbors had come outside to see what was happening, and the fire trucks arrived and the firefighters rushed inside, and Sarah stood there on the lawn holding her crying children, watching her house fill with smoke, and Max was sitting right next to them, calm now like he knew his job was done, and the firefighters managed to contain the fire before it spread too far, but the kitchen was destroyed and part of the living room wall was damaged, and as Sarah stood there watching them work, she replayed everything that had happened that afternoon in her mind, and she thought about Max scratching at that wall, and she realized he had been scratching at the exact spot where the fire started, and she thought about him sniffing near the stove, and she realized he must have smelled the burning before any human could detect it, and she thought about him blocking the kids from going into the kitchen, and she realized he was trying to keep them away from the danger, and she thought about him pulling Tyler by his shirt, and she realized he was trying to get them as far away from the fire as possible, and every single thing she had yelled at him for, every single behavior she had called bad, was actually Max trying to save her children, and her knees felt weak, and she slowly sank down onto the grass, and Max came over to her and sat down beside her, and she looked at him, at his dirty fur and his cut paws, and she remembered that she had not even asked how he had gotten those cuts, and then she realized that the shattered glass door she had been so angry about, Max must have broken it because he was trying to create ventilation, or maybe he was trying to create an escape route, or maybe he was just desperately trying to get her attention in any way he could, and she had screamed at him and locked him in the laundry room and called him a bad dog, and she reached out and touched his face and whispered, "I am so sorry, buddy," and Max just leaned into her hand and wagged his tail once because he did not hold grudges, he never did, and Emma and Tyler came over and wrapped their arms around Max, and Emma said, "Mommy, Max was trying to help us the whole time, was he not?" And Sarah nodded with tears streaming down her face, and she said, "Yes, baby, he was, and I did not listen," and Tyler buried his face in Max's fur and said, "Good boy, Max, good boy," and Max just sat there surrounded by his family, calm and patient like he always was, and the fire chief came over and told Sarah that the fire had started from faulty wiring behind the stove, and if it had gone undetected for another 10 or 15 minutes it could have spread through the walls and become much more dangerous, and he asked how she had noticed it in time, and Sarah looked at Max and said, "My dog, he knew something was wrong before any of us did," and the fire chief nodded and said, "Dogs have incredible senses, they can detect things humans cannot, and you are lucky to have him," and Sarah thought about that word lucky, and she realized just how true it was, and later that night after they had gone to stay at her sister's house and the kids were finally asleep, Sarah sat on the floor next to Max and just looked at him, and she thought about all the times she had gotten impatient with him and all the times she had dismissed his behavior as annoying or unnecessary, and she realized that she had never really trusted him the way he deserved to be trusted, because Max had always been watching over them, always been alert, always been ready to protect them, and she had seen it as a nuisance instead of a gift, and she made a silent promise to herself that she would do better because Max had shown her what real loyalty looked like, and it was not about waiting for praise or expecting gratitude, it was about doing what needed to be done even when no one understood, and even when everyone was angry, and even when it meant getting hurt in the process. And over the following weeks, as they dealt with insurance and repairs and all the chaos that comes after a house fire, Sarah noticed herself changing, because now when Max started pacing or barking at something, she did not get impatient. Instead, she stopped what she was doing and tried to understand what he was sensing, and sometimes it was nothing important, just a squirrel outside or a delivery truck passing by, but sometimes it was something that needed attention, like the time he kept sniffing at the water heater, and Sarah called a technician who found a small leak that could have become a big problem, and she learned to trust Max in a way she never had before, and Max seemed to sense the change because he became even more relaxed around her, like he finally felt understood. And Emma started telling everyone at school about how Max saved their lives, and Tyler drew pictures of Max as a superhero, and Sarah kept one of those drawings on her refrigerator as a reminder of what had happened and what she had learned. And sometimes at night, when the house was quiet and the kids were asleep and Max was lying at the foot of her bed, Sarah would look at him and feel this overwhelming gratitude mixed with lingering guilt, because she had come so close to failing him and failing her children, and she knew she would carry that lesson with her for the rest of her life. And it was a hard lesson, but it was also a beautiful one, because it taught her that love does not always look the way we expect it to, and sometimes the people or the animals who love us most will do things that seem wrong or confusing or even destructive, but if we take the time to look deeper, we might find that they were protecting us all along. And Max had protected her family with everything he had, and she would spend the rest of his life making sure he knew how grateful she was. And as she lay there in the darkness listening to Max breathe, she whispered one more time, "Thank you, buddy, thank you for not giving up on us even when we did not deserve it." And Max's tail thumped softly against the bed because he heard her and he understood, and that was enough for both of them, because some bonds do not need big words or grand gestures, they just need presence and patience and trust, and that is what Max had given them from the very beginning, if only they had known how to see it sooner. Have you ever blamed someone who was actually protecting you? Share this with someone who believes dogs are family.